Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another video. This is a GameMaker Studio tutorial on a top-down shooter. If you guys watched the last video, I will sound a little bit different this time because I'm using a different microphone. Hopefully it still sounds pretty good. And this is going to be a super cruisy tutorial. Don't want anyone to stress. I understand tutorial videos can be quite stressful. This is going to be a bit different. It's going to be a bit of a cruisy tutorial. Hopefully you guys were quite relaxed in the last episode. And yeah, in the last episode, we got the basic movement down. You can see we can spin around. We can also move around with WASD. So that's the basic player movement that we've done. If you didn't see the last episode, I will leave a link in the description. Also, if you have any questions, please leave a comment. I will be super active in the comment section, so don't hesitate to drop a message. All right, in this episode today, we are going to do the shooting. So this is the code here for the movement. But for the shooting, we're also going to drop some code here. But first, we're just going to have to add a new sprite, which will be the bullet sprite. So we come in here, sprite bullet. And we can do 64 by 64. Why not actually? Let's make it a bit more realistic size. We can do a height of like 12 maybe. It's still going to be quite a large bullet. That's fine, just for visual purposes. You guys can see what's going on. This is going to be a projectile bullet as well. So this isn't going to be like a ray trace type hit. I will be doing that in a future video. If you guys do want to learn how to do like a ray trace. Or a hit scan might be a more accurate word. And what the difference is that we'll do something like that. Beautiful. Difference is a hit scan type bullet would instantaneously shoot to the mouse. And anything between our character and the mouse would instantaneously get hit. This is sort of the more easier way to do it, where you just have a projectile that comes out of the player. It's really up to you what you want. We're going to go like this because this is probably the most simple. This is the sort of bullets that you would see in like a bullet hell kind of game. So now we've got the sprite bullet. We're going to also in here make this centered. That's good enough. And then we're going to create a new object called object bullet. Boom. Give it the sprite that we just made. And this actually doesn't need any code. The bullet, for the time being, we don't actually need anything in the bullet. So that's super easy. The bullet is actually done. All we're going to do is add a way for the player to fire the bullet. What we're going to do is we're going to come into create. Also, I made my variable declarations in the create function, which means I just basically came up with some new variables in the create function last time. You can also do this down here in variable definitions. I think this got added at some point. Most of the tutorials will probably just do it in the create, like what I'm doing, because that's the old school way to do it. I haven't really played around with this, but you can, if you want, you can declare the variables down here if you're more comfortable doing that. But we're just going to do it in the create function. So we're going to make a couple variables. We're going to have one. So we're just going to do an automatic weapon. It's a bit easier. And we're going to do fire cooldown. We'll call it something like that. You can call it whatever you want. And we're just going to set that to 0. And then if you press Control D, it duplicates the line. I'm going to make another variable called fire cooldown max. And we can set that to something like, maybe like 5. And this would be 5 frames. So this would, you'll see in a second what we're going to do. But essentially this fire cooldown max is how many frames between each bullet firing. All right, awesome. Now, if we go into the step event, we can write some code. Bullet firing. All right. So I'm also going to say this as well, there is another way to do what we're about to do in the events. You can go in here and make it so when you click the mouse, things happen like this. You can do this. You could do mouse like left down, for example. You can do it in this way, but I think that it's going to be better to do it in the step event. Again, similar to the last tutorial, the main reason for doing this is just in case the player wants to change hotkeys, or for example, you want there to be multiple ways to fire the bullet. Maybe you want to add controller support later, yada, yada, yada. Doesn't really matter. We're just going to do the bullet firing in the step event. And all we're going to do is we're going to have to check whether or not the left mouse button is being pressed. And that's actually pretty easy to do. I'm actually just going to make this if statement here, and we're just going to check for mouse check button. And what this does here is it just basically every time this is ran, which is in the step function, so every frame, it's going to check whether or not we're holding down the mouse button. There is also mouse check button pressed. This checks whether or not you pressed the left mouse button or pressed a mouse button on that frame, and released is checks whether you released on that frame. You can use these if you want. If you're making a semi-automatic weapon, for example, you might use mouse check button pressed. We're just going to use mouse check button. And then for the argument here, so this takes one argument, which is what button is it checking for. And in GameMaker, the mouse buttons are just, you just type MB underscore, and the mouse buttons are stored as these values here. So you can choose which button we want to choose. We're going to choose the left mouse button. That's probably the most common for shooting. So if we are holding the left mouse button, what we're going to do is we're going to check whether or not this cooldown is below or equal to 0. So we can do if fire cooldown is greater than or equal to 0. And that just means if we're ready to fire the next bullet, so it's been a long enough time, then we're going to fire the bullet here. And I'll actually do this fire cooldown bit first, so it makes a bit of sense. What we're going to do is, down here, we can do it, is we make every second, or every step, sorry, fire cooldown is going to get reduced by 1. So we have here fire cooldown minus equals 1, and that is the equivalent of writing, if you guys who don't know, fire cooldown equals fire cooldown minus 1, which means that every step, which is every frame in our game, our fire cooldown is going to get reduced by 1. And you could also write this, I believe, like this. That's the same thing as well. Negative, negative just increments 1 down. If you write plus, plus, it increments 1 up. We're just going to use minus equals 1. That's how I like to write it. And that means that if our fire cooldown is smaller than or equal to 0, then we're going to fire the bullet. All right, so we go yada, yada, yada. Let's just say variable b equals instance create depth. So what this is going to do, instance create, there's 2 different ones. There's depth and I think there's layer. I don't use layer, but instant create depth is just going to create a new bullet. It creates an instance of an object, which means, so we have the bullet here, and this is basically where we write how a bullet behaves, all that kind of stuff. Much like here, we have how a player behaves, but creating an instance of it means we're going to create a new bullet inside our game, like inside our room. And we got variable b equals instant create depth. We don't have to do that, but what this essentially does is that the instance create depth function will return an ID for this bullet, and if we store that, like we have here as a variable, we're storing the ID of the bullet. That means later on we can manipulate that bullet. It means that later on we can do things like b.speed and stuff like that equals 10, right? It means we can easily change the bullet straight here. We're not going to do that right now, but we might as well write it like this because we probably will have to do that at some point. All right, and we're going to create the bullet at the origin of the player. So we just put in the X and the Y. For the depth is essentially how it's kind of like the z-axis, you could imagine. It's essentially how far away from the camera it is, or you could think of it as which order the instance or the object gets drawn. Basically what it means, the way you can think of it is if something's got more depth, it means it's further away from the camera. And since our camera's above, higher depth means that it'll be behind an object with lower depth. And so if in this circumstance, we don't want the bullet to be drawn above the player. Maybe you do, but I think we should draw the player above the bullet. I think that makes more sense. So we're just going to put the depth to, let's just say 5. And by default, our player should have 0 depth, which means that our player will appear on top of the bullet. The object that we're creating an instance of is going to be object. I'll actually zoom in a bit so you guys can see a bit better. Because you can see down here, it shows you, if you guys didn't realize, whenever you use a function, it shows you down the bottom here, the arguments of the function and what you're putting in. And that's super helpful. So here we're going to create an object bullet. And this var struct argument at the end is optional. It just allows you to change some of the variables in the instance that you're creating. We're not going to, don't worry about that. We don't have to change anything. If we do, we can use our b that we just got here as well to do so. So we're creating a new bullet at the player's x, the player's y at a depth of 5, and we're storing the instance as b. Awesome. So since fire cooldown is actually starting at 0, it means we can fire straight off the bat. But what we want to do is when we fire, we also want to create a cooldown, which means we want to pause before we can fire again. So we're just going to set the fire cooldown to fire cooldown max. So now if we hold down a left mouse button, this code will run here. And it will basically, if we're ready to fire, we create the bullet, we fire, we create the bullet, which is firing the bullet, and we set the fire cooldown to whatever we want this fire cooldown to be, which at the moment is 5, so 5 frames. So now if I launch the game, this should work. Also something to note is that the fire cooldown keeps ticking down. So technically this number is going to be like, if we don't fire, it's just going to keep getting smaller and smaller. You can fix that by doing fire cooldown. You do if fire cooldown is greater than 0, then we will run this code. You don't have to do this because it doesn't really matter if there's a fire cooldown variable that's negative 1,000 thousands, but you can do it like this. So you write if fire cooldown is greater than 0, fire cooldown minus equals 1. It's also important to note in GameMaker, you'll see up here I used brackets for the if statement. And here I didn't use brackets for the if statement. It doesn't actually make a difference. So GameMaker language is pretty lenient in terms of what you can and can't do. Same as colons. You don't even have to put colons in GameMaker language. It doesn't really care. It's kind of goated in terms of like accessibility from other languages because you might come from a language where you do use colons or don't use colons. But at the same time, it can be confusing because, yeah, it kind of just allows you to do some weird things. So if you want consistency's sake, you can put brackets around as well, like this. All right, so let's see if this works. We're going to launch it. Take a look. I hold the left button. All right, awesome. I forgot to do the next part. This is quite a nice drawing program that we made. Yep, quite impressive. All right, ignore what I'm drawing there. Beautiful. All right, so the problem is we are spawning the bullets, but we are not actually, the bullets don't do anything. They don't have any speed and they don't have any direction. So GameMaker has speed and direction as inbuilt variables, which means we don't have to create our own speed and direction variables, and we don't have to keep adding to our X and Y based on these speed and direction variables. So since we have B here, which B is our bullet, we can just set the speed of the bullet, for example. And And the speed, we can set this to whatever we want. We could make a variable if we want in the player. Bullet speed, I'm actually going to do that. So we go on the create here. We can create a variable called bullet speed. And we can set that to whatever we want. Let's just set it to, we'll set to 5. Why not? You always want to create variables for things. Don't have magic numbers. And if you have something in your code that looks like this is called a magic number. At least to my knowledge. And it's basically just a random number that it's easy because you're like, oh, speed equals 10. Cool, that's easy to write. But later on, you might get confused. You might not know what this number is. In this case, it's easy to tell what this 10 is. But it also means that if you want to change the bullet speed, you're going to have to go through your code and find where the magic number is. And it's a lot easier just to change variables if you have more stacked on top of each other like this. So we want to change the bullet speed. We just go into where we're declaring our variables, just change it right here. So yeah, don't use magic numbers. So let's just make this bullet speed. So b.speed. This is setting the speed of this bullet instance. This is how you do it. You just put a dot. Probably in most languages, a dot just means we're setting something. Not necessarily true because you can run functions with a dot. Dot, we're just doing something, all right? So b.speed means we're accessing speed from this instance here. That's a better way to think of it. We're accessing speed and we're setting it to bullet speed. That's probably the smarter way to think about it. Because you also, if you do have a function, let's say we have like, let's say we had in our bullet, we had an explode function. We don't. I'm just going to do some example. If you wanted to access that function, you would write like b.explode. And that would run the function. You can see we don't have any errors here. That would run the explode function. Of course, if we ran this, it would just break because we don't have an explode function. But if we did have an explode function in our bullet, that's one way we would get the bullet to run it. All right, awesome. So setting the speed's easy. Set the speed to bullet speed, cool. But we also got to set the direction. And which direction do we want the bullet to fire? So for the direction, we want to set it. So we'd set it the same way as b.direction. But the question is, what do we set this to? And we want it to be the direction of the mouse. So GameMaker actually has, I'm actually going to launch Paint real quick. Why not? Can never miss an opportunity to launch Paint. Does this work? Oh my god, we're not updating. So in GameMaker, there's a super nice function you can use. So let's say this is our player here. This is going to be a really rough drawing. And let's say this is where the mouse cursor is. Usually to determine the angle, you would do some trigonometry. We're not going to have to do that. It's going to be super easy, super chill. So in GameMaker Studios, the angles work like this, where to the right is 0 degrees. Straight up is 90. So you can imagine that's 0, that's 90 degrees. This is 180. And this is 270, which is pretty common way to do it in like maths. You would start at 0 being horizontal, and you'd go around this direction counterclockwise. So it's important to remember that with directions, we start facing to the right, and then we go counterclockwise. So I might have touched on that in the last video, I can't remember, but if we didn't, there it is. Luckily, GameMaker has a super good function, which is just point direction. And what point direction will do is it will just give us the direction between 2 points. So you put in a start point, which will be our player. You put in an end point, which will be where the mouse is. And it will give us the direction that we need. So that's super useful. So in here, what we can do is we can just set the direction of the bullet to the direction using this function point direction. We set it to the direction of, and you can see here, you have 2 points you put in. X1 and Y1 are the start point, X2 and Y2 are the end point. So the start point is going to be our player, which since we're calling this from the player, that's just going to be X and Y. And the endpoint is going to be the mouse X and mouse Y. So these are just two variables that just get this just gets the mouse position here. So we're going from our player to our mouse position. That is the direction that we want the bullet to travel. And we want our speed of the bullet to be this bullet speed that we've predefined. There's one more thing. I'll actually run it and show you. Just so you guys see it firsthand. If I shoot, there's going to be one more problem. So you can see the bullets are traveling towards my mouse, but they're all facing to the right. They're not facing the correct direction. So we're going to change. We're going to change one more thing, and that is the image angle. And that, as the name implies, is the angle that the image is facing. And we can just set that to this point direction as well, if we want. Or we can set it to b.direction, which is already been assigned to this point direction. So we can do it like this, it's fine. And yeah, I'm gonna turn the bullet speed up a little bit because 5 is really slow. Let's change that to 10. And let's see what this looks like. So we've got our player, we can move around, and now if we fire, it fires pretty quick actually. But you guys can see what's going on here. If you wanted to fire slower, you would just increase the time of fire cooldown max, which is going to be essentially our cooldown. It's what the cooldown variable gets set to after it fires. I think that's to 20. That's going to be firing at a quarter of the speed it was. And there we are. That looks pretty good, to be honest. Next thing we're going to add in the next episode is going to be collisions. So we're going to add just some basic collisions to walls. We can add some wall objects. We can make a little map, and we can make it so our player can't walk through the walls. And we might also add some enemies for the bullets to collide with. So yeah, make sure to give a like, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.